The map of Central Europe in 1914 presents a paradox that modern eyes, trained by the neat ethnic borders of the post-war era, often fail to grasp. We are taught to see the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a shambling corpse, a prison of nations held together by little more than the senile tenacity of an aging monarch and the rusty bayonets of a dysfunctional army. Yet the forensic evidence of the time tells a far more compelling and tragic story. The dual monarchy was not a state in decay. It was a sophisticated, integrated economic powerhouse that provided a level of legal unity unseen in the region for centuries. It was the functional miracle, a common market that managed to balance the interests of 11 distinct nationalities through a shared bureaucracy and a common crown. This system functioned far more effectively than the volatile, ethnically homogeneous states that surrounded it. The tragedy of its eventual collapse lies not in an inherent failure of its multi-ethnic design, but in how a system built for delicate internal compromise was forced to endure the brutal, singular demands of a total war it was never intended to fight. Driven by the necessity of survival in a modernizing world, the empire had spent the decades following the 1867 Compromise constructing a framework of legal and economic integration that was decades ahead of its time. Inevitably, this created a chain of consequences that bound the various nations together in ways that went beyond mere political loyalty. The General Civil Code of 1811, meticulously updated, provided a unified legal horizon that allowed a merchant in Trieste to trade with a factory owner in Prague with total confidence in the enforcement of contracts. Consequently, the empire became a magnet for international capital. Investors from London and Paris did not see a crumbling ruin. They saw a reliable fortress of predictability. The krona, the imperial currency, was a symbol of this stability, anchored to the gold standard and respected from the banks of the Danube to the markets of the Levant. This economic integration was not merely a matter of policy, but of physical reality. The steel veins of the railways connected the grain fields of the Hungarian plains to the industrial heartlands of Bohemia, creating a biological interdependence where each limb of the empire relied on the other for its vital sustenance. The glue that held this sprawling organism together was the imperial bureaucracy, a third estate of civil servants who transcended ethnic lines. In 1914, the collective psychological state of the era, the zeitgeist, was defined by a profound, almost religious belief in the permanence of this order. To the citizens of the empire, the state was not an oppressor, but a guarantor of security. It was a world where every career path was regulated, every pension was secured, and every social interaction was governed by a complex but predictable etiquette. The spirit of the times was one of cautious progress, where the frictions of nationalism were viewed not as fatal flaws, but as administrative challenges to be managed through the meticulous application of the Habsburg way. A policy of muddling through that prioritized stability over ideological purity. People did not expect the world to end. They expected it to continue its slow, orderly march toward a more prosperous future under the benevolent gaze of the Kaiser. Evidence of this functional reality is found in the most mundane of places, the thick, leather-bound ledgers of the regional tax offices. A tax return from a small business in Sarajevo, dated April 1914, reveals a meticulous accounting of profits and losses that ignores the ethnic tensions bubbling beneath the surface. The documents are written in German, the language of the state, but the names of the employees represent a tapestry of the empire's diversity. These records are a forensic anchor, proving that the day-to-day life of the empire was defined by the pursuit of middle-class respectability rather than the drive for national secession. In the cafes of Vienna, the newspapers of the day discussed the latest developments in psychoanalysis or the newest operas by Strauss, treating the political bickering in the Reichsstadt as a form of theater rather than a sign of systemic collapse. The empire was a state that worked because it provided its citizens with something more valuable than national pride. It provided them with a future. However, the very qualities that made the empire a miracle of peacetime management made it uniquely vulnerable to the shock of 1914. The system was a masterpiece of peacetime engineering, designed for negotiation, slow deliberation, and the balancing of interests. When the assassination in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances, the empire was forced to pivot from a state of multi-ethnic management to a state of singular military mobilization. This transition was not just difficult, it was biologically impossible for a system built on compromise. The war demanded a level of centralized, ruthless efficiency that the Habsburg state had intentionally avoided in order to keep its various nationalities satisfied. Driven by the existential threat of the conflict, the state began to cannibalize its own foundations, replacing the rule of law with military decrees and the common market with a desperate, localized struggle for resources. Consequently, the social contract that had held the empire together began to fray, not because of ancient ethnic hatreds, but because the state could no longer fulfill its primary promise of order and predictability. Consider the life of a man like Anton, a junior postal inspector stationed in the mountain town of Königgrätz. Anton spoke German to his superiors, Polish to his neighbors, and enough Ukrainian and Romanian to resolve disputes at the local sorting office. To him, the empire was not an abstract concept or an oppressive force. It was the blue uniform he wore with pride and the standardized forms that ensured a letter sent from a remote village in the Carpathians would arrive at a specific address in Trieste within 48 hours. He was a microcog in a macro machine, his identity defined by his service to a system that offered him a path from a peasant background to the lower rungs of the middle class, a future that was, until the summer of 1914, as certain as the rising sun. By 1916, Anton was gone, his meticulous records replaced by casualty lists, and his uniform a shroud in a nameless trench. He was a witness to the transition from the functional miracle to the industrial slaughterhouse, a man who saw his entire worldview dissolve in the smoke of locomotives that were no longer bringing trade, but death. The fragility of history is perhaps nowhere more evident in the July crisis itself. Had the driver of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car not taken a wrong turn on a street in Sarajevo, or had the Archduke's own plans for trialism, a reform that would have elevated the Slavic peoples to equal status, been allowed to come to fruition, the inevitable collapse might never have occurred. The empire was not a house of cards waiting for a breeze. It was a sturdy bridge that was struck by a once-in-a-century hurricane. A small decision, a different telegram, or a few minutes of delay might have allowed the system to survive long enough to reform itself once again, potentially sparing Europe the horrors of the 20th century. Today, the legacy of this state is visible in the architecture of the modern European project. The contemporary effort to create an integrated Europe is, in many ways, an attempt to reconstruct the functional miracle without the burden of the crown. We live in the shadow of a state that should have worked, a reminder that the integration of Central Europe was not a modern invention, but a recovered inheritance.
The ink on the Ausgleich of 1667 did not merely sign a treaty, it etched a suicide pact into the parchment of Central European history. Driven by the humiliating sting of the Prussian needles at Königgrätz, the Habsburg monarchy sought a desperate equilibrium to prevent the total dissolution of its ancient holdings. This constitutional compromise transformed the Austrian Empire into the Dual Monarchy of Austria-Hungary, a bifurcated entity bound only by a single sovereign, a unified military, and a shared foreign policy. Yet this structural integrity was a facade, concealing an architecture of paralysis that would eventually render the state a hollowed-out giant. The psychological state of the era, particularly within the gilded halls of the Hofburg, was one of profound Fortwursteln, a weary determination to muddle through at any cost. There was a collective sense that the empire was a beautiful, decaying clockwork mechanism, one where the gears were grinding against one another with increasing friction, yet no one dared to apply oil for fear of dissolving the very glue that held the pieces in place. Inevitably, the creation of two distinct legislative bodies, the Reichsrat in Vienna and the Diet in Budapest, turned every administrative necessity into a theater of existential conflict. While the Emperor King Franz Joseph retained control over the common affairs, the purse strings were held by two parliaments with diametrically opposed visions of the state's future. The Hungarian elite, having secured a degree of sovereignty they had craved since 1848, viewed any strengthening of the central military or bureaucracy as a direct threat to their hard-won autonomy. Consequently, the decennial renegotiation of the economic quota, the proportion of the budget each half of the empire contributed, became a recurring constitutional crisis. Evidence of this friction is found in the weary diaries of Count Friedrich Ferdinand von Beust, who noted that the empire was no longer governed by laws, but by a series of fragile temporary truces. Each year the budget was delayed, the military slipped further into obsolescence, as the Hungarian parliament refused to vote for increased levies unless the language of command was changed from German to Magyar, a concession the Austrian military leadership viewed as the first step toward total disintegration. The tragedy of this paralysis was most acutely felt by those forgotten in the 1867 arrangement, the Slavic populations. For the Czechs, Poles, Croats, and Serbs, the dual monarchy was not a partnership, but a dual tyranny. There was a moment, fleeting and fragile, where the concept of trialism could have altered the trajectory of the 20th century. Had Franz Joseph followed through on his 1871 promise to be crowned King of Bohemia in Prague, the empire might have evolved into a tripartite federation, granting the Slavs a seat at the table and neutralizing the centrifugal forces of nationalism. However, the Hungarian Prime Minister Gyula Andrassy effectively vetoed the move, fearing that any concession to the Czechs would embolden the minorities within Hungary's own borders. Because of this single failure of political will, the Slavic voice was silenced within the halls of power, driving their aspirations underground and into the arms of radical pan-Slavism. The fragility of history is revealed here. A single coronation ceremony in Prague might have siphoned the oxygen from the fire that would eventually ignite in Sarajevo. This systemic rot was not merely a matter of high politics. It manifested in the lived reality of the imperial machinery. Consider the life of a junior clerk named Victor, stationed in a drafty administrative office in Lemberg. In 1898, Victor spent 6 months processing a single requisition for new boots for a Galician infantry regiment. The request was rejected 3 times, once because the form was filled out in German but sent to a district with a Polish majority, once because the budget for the leather was frozen during a parliamentary filibuster in Budapest, and once because the official stamp of the Austrian Ministry of Defense was deemed not sufficiently representative by a Hungarian auditor. Victor, like thousands of other bureaucrats, spent his career navigating a labyrinth of spite, watching as the physical equipment of the army grew tattered and the morale of the multi-ethnic conscripts dissolved into a bitter realization that they were dying for a state that could not even agree on the language of their orders. As the century turned, the geopolitical landscape darkened, but the dual monarchy remained frozen in its 1867 mold. The military, once the pride of the Habsburgs, entered the age of the machine gun and the heavy howitzer with a budget that was a fraction of its neighbors. Driven by a fear of Hungarian secession, the central government in Vienna could not modernize the rail networks necessary for rapid mobilization without triggering a debate over which capital would control the switches. The spirit of the times was a strange mixture of avant-garde cultural brilliance and administrative decay. While Klimt painted his gold-leafed dreams, the imperial staff was still calculating troop movements based on the speed of horse-drawn caissons. The forensic reality of the 1914 mobilization orders shows a chaotic scramble to reconcile 18 different languages and 2 separate supply chains, a logistical nightmare that was the direct result of 40 years of legislative deadlock. Ultimately, the architecture of paralysis ensured that when the crisis of 1914 arrived, the empire reacted not with the precision of a modern state, but with the clumsy desperation of a wounded animal. The dual monarchy had spent its final decades litigating its own existence rather than preparing for its survival. The 1967 compromise, intended to be a foundation, had become a cage. The legacy of this institutional gridlock persists into the modern era, visible in the fractured borders of the Balkans and the deep-seated cultural anxieties of Central Europe. The architecture of paralysis serves as a haunting reminder that a state that cannot reform itself through its laws will inevitably find itself dismantled by its failures. The maps of the region were redrawn in 1919, not just by the victors of a war, but by the ghosts of the legislators who for 50 years chose the safety of a stalemate over the risk of a future. The silence of the abandoned trenches on the Isonzo front is the final heavy echo of a parliament that simply could not find the words to agree.
By the summer of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire existed less as a unified modern state and more as a delicate, ossified agreement between 11 major linguistic groups held together by the singular aging silhouette of Emperor Franz Joseph I. The collective psychological state of the era was one of strange, fatalistic suspension. A society that had spent decades meticulously managing its internal frictions suddenly found itself intoxicated by the prospect of a clarifying fire. In the coffee houses of Vienna and the promenades of Budapest, the outbreak of war was greeted not with dread, but with a profound sense of relief, as if the declaration of hostilities had finally solved the impossible riddle of imperial identity. This was the spirit of the times, a belief that the complex multi-ethnic machinery of the Habsburgs could be forged into a singular weapon. However, this optimism ignored the fundamental fragility of the imperial structure, which relied on a professional bureaucracy and a military caste that functioned as the only truly supranational entities in a sea of rising nationalisms. The war did not just test these institutions, it consumed them in its opening months, initiating a chain of consequences that would lead to the total atomization of the state. The destruction began not in the halls of government, but in the muddy high-grass plains of Galicia and the treacherous ravines of the Serbian frontier. Driven by a desperate need to secure a decisive victory before the Russian steamroller could fully mobilize, the Austro-Hungarian High Command committed its finest professional regiments to a series of aggressive, archaic charges against modern machine gun fire. Inevitably, the results were catastrophic. By the end of 1914, the empire had suffered over 1 million casualties.
But the most damaging loss was the systematic decimation of the professional officer corps. These were the men who spoke the Armeesprache, the specialized vocabulary of 80 German commands that allowed a Czech sergeant to lead a Bosnian platoon under a Hungarian colonel. When these polyglot professionals were buried in the mass graves of 1914, the linguistic glue of the empire dissolved with them. Consequently, the replacements were reserve officers, teachers, lawyers, and clerks who possessed neither the military experience nor the linguistic facility to bridge the ethnic divides. A diary entry from a reserve lieutenant named Stefan, dated October 12, 1914, captures this descent. He describes standing before his company of Ruthenian peasants, realizing that his commands in German were met only with hollow, uncomprehending stares, while the distant thunder of Russian artillery grew louder. He was a man leading a ghost unit in a language they considered the tongue of their oppressors. As the professional army withered, the Allied blockade of the Adriatic began to tighten, transforming the administrative friction of the empire into a terminal struggle for biological survival. The blockade was not merely a military maneuver, it was a psychological wedge driven between the imperial center and the agrarian periphery. By 1915, the centralized food supply system, which had once ensured that Hungarian wheat fed Viennese factory workers, began to fracture under the weight of local desperation. The total nature of the mobilization meant that the countryside was stripped of its young men and its horses, leaving the harvests to rot or remain unplanted. In Vienna, the bread lines grew into semi-permanent fixtures of the urban landscape, where the sawdust content in the loaves increased with each passing month. This scarcity triggered a fundamental shift in loyalty. If the emperor, in his distant palace, could no longer guarantee a loaf of bread, then the abstract concept of imperial citizenship was a luxury that the starving could no longer afford. The local turn was born of this hunger. Loyalty retreated from the imperial capital to the village council, the ethnic club, and the family unit. The state was no longer a protector, it was a predator, arriving in the form of requisition officers who seized the last cow from a starving Istrian widow. The breakdown was accelerated by the logistical paralysis of the imperial railway system. Had the 1916 harvest been even 10% more bountiful, or had the railway gauges and scheduling remained under a unified, efficient civilian military command, the internal cohesion of the empire might have endured through the winter. However, the system was choked by the competing demands of the front and the frantic, uncoordinated efforts of regional governors to hoard resources for their own people. This was the forensic reality of the collapse. A weather report from the winter of 1916 shows record-breaking freezes that cracked the iron of the overburdened locomotives, halting grain shipments for weeks. During this period, the Emperor Franz Joseph I passed away, and with him died the last tangible symbol of a unified past. His successor, Karl, inherited a throne that was already being dismantled by the very people it claimed to rule. The collective psyche shifted from a fatalistic duty to a primal self-reliance. The soldiers at the front, hearing reports of their families starving at home, began to desert in staggering numbers, not out of political ideology, but out of a desperate need to return to their small plots of land to ensure their children's survival. By 1917, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a state in name only, a hollowed-out shell where the only functioning authority was the local ethnic committee. The professional multi-ethnic officer corps was a memory, replaced by a fragmented force that viewed the war not as a struggle for the Habsburgs, but as a chaotic opportunity to secure a better position for their respective nations in the inevitable aftermath. The hunger was the primary architect of this new reality. In the freezing bread lines of Prague, women who had once identified as loyal subjects of the crown now spoke of our nation versus their war. This transition from imperial to local identity was not a sudden revolution, but an attrition of the soul, a slow realization that the grand architecture of the empire was an unnecessary burden in a world reduced to the search for calories. The survival strategies of the ethnic groups, the Czechs, the Poles, the South Slavs, became the blueprints for the nation-states that would follow. They stopped looking to Vienna for answers and began looking to each other, creating shadow governments that waited only for the final collapse of the military front to assert their independence. The legacy of this disintegration remains etched into the map of Central Europe. The borders that were eventually drawn at the peace conferences were often merely formal recognitions of the local realities established by starving peasants and deserting soldiers in the winter of 1917. The transition from a massive, multi-ethnic empire to a cluster of smaller, often ethnically homogeneous states was a process born of total war's ability to strip away everything except the most immediate and primal identities. Today, the grand neoclassical government buildings of Vienna and Budapest stand as silent witnesses to a time when a dozen different peoples shared a single currency and a single purpose. Yet the invisible lines of distrust and the fierce localism that still occasionally ripple through European politics are the direct descendants of those breadlines and those silent, uncomprehending companies in the Galician mud. The attrition of identity was complete. The empire did not just lose a war, it lost the very idea of itself, proving that when the center can no longer feed the body, the limbs will inevitably seek a life of their own.
The evening of November 21, 1916 was defined by a silence so absolute it seemed to exert its own physical pressure upon the corridors of Schönbrunn Palace. Outside, the Vienna air was a damp, biting gray, but inside the fourth room of the emperor's apartment, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old parchment. On the nightstand sat a half-empty bottle of digitalis and a pocket watch that had ticked through 68 years of a single reign. When the personal physician, Dr. Kurzel, finally stepped into the hallway to announce that Franz Joseph I had passed, he was not merely announcing the death of a man, but the expiration of a 19th century consciousness. For the millions of subjects from the Alpine peaks to the Carpathian basin, the emperor had been the only immutable fact of existence, a living bridge between a feudal past and a fractured modern world. Driven by this sudden vacuum, the collective psyche of the Austro-Hungarian Empire suffered a shock from which it would never recover. The old gentleman had been the singular gravity holding 13 nationalities in a precarious orbit, and with his passing, that gravity simply ceased to exist. Inevitably, the burden of this disintegrating world fell upon the shoulders of the 29-year-old Archduke Karl, who ascended the throne as Karl I amidst a house already consumed by the fires of a total war. Unlike his great-uncle, who had ruled through rigid bureaucracy and the sheer endurance of his own persona, Karl was a man of nervous energy and desperate sincerity. He inherited a state where the spirit of the times had shifted from imperial loyalty to a frantic, starving nationalism. In the winter of 1916, the citizens of Vienna were not merely grieving a monarch, they were standing in bread lines that stretched for blocks in the biting sleet, their devotion to the Habsburgs eroding, with every ounce of sawdust mixed into their flour. Karl understood that the empire's survival was tethered to an immediate peace, yet he found himself shackled to a German military alliance that viewed his realm as little more than a secondary theater of supply. This psychological disconnect between a young reformist emperor and a war-weary, radicalizing populace created a tension that made every subsequent political move feel like a gesture made in a vacuum. Consequently,
Karl's first major initiative was a clandestine attempt to bypass his own generals and the German High Command. In the spring of 1917, he initiated the Sixtus Affair, utilizing his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, as a secret conduit to the French government. The forensic evidence of this desperation remains in the handwritten letters Karl sent, where he expressed a willingness to support French claims to Alsace-Lorraine, a staggering betrayal of his German allies. Had these negotiations remained a private overture, or had the French leadership been more willing to trust a Habsburg plea, the war might have ended 18 months earlier, saving millions of lives and perhaps preserving a federalized version of the empire. However, the fragility of history intervened when the secret was leaked, exposing Karl as a traitor to Berlin and a weakling to his own people. This failure stripped the young emperor of his remaining diplomatic leverage, leaving him a prisoner of an alliance that was dragging him toward a shared grave. While Karl looked outward for peace, the internal structure of the empire was being sabotaged by the very men who claimed to be its most loyal defenders. In Budapest, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Count István Tisza, maintained a stranglehold on the legislative process with the cold precision of a grand master. Driven by a dogmatic commitment to the Dual Monarchy's 1687 compromise, Tisza and the Hungarian elite rejected every proposal for federalization that would have granted equal rights to the Slavs, Romanians, and Czechs within the empire. To the Hungarians, any concession to the minorities was a death sentence for their own privileged status. This internal paralysis meant that Karl's vision of a United States of Greater Austria remained a theoretical phantom. A weather report from a specific Tuesday in May 1917 noted a sudden violent thunderstorm over the Danube, an apt metaphor for the political climate, as Tisza's refusal to reform turned the empire's internal borders into fault lines. The Slavic soldiers in the trenches, hearing of the obstinacy in Budapest, began to wonder why they were dying for a crown that refused to recognize their existence. The human cost of this political stagnation is best captured in the life of a single unnamed telegraph clerk in a provincial Galician town in early 1918. For 3 years he had processed the mounting casualty lists, his fingers stained with the purple ink of the official stamps. But by that final spring, he was processing more desertion notices than deaths. He watched as the administrative machinery of the empire simply began to evaporate, not through a grand revolution, but through a quiet, pervasive refusal to obey. By the time the summer heat hit the plains, the spirit of the times had moved beyond reform. It had moved to survival. The authority of the central government in Vienna had become a ghost, its decrees ignored by local councils who were already hoarding grain and organizing their own national militias. The empire was no longer a functioning state. It was a collection of people waiting for the inevitable signal to leave. That signal arrived in October 16, 1918, in the form of the People's Manifesto. In a final frantic attempt to save his crown, Karl issued a proclamation transforming the Austrian half of the empire into a federation of national states. He intended it as a blueprint for a new democratic union, but he had waited too long. In the forensic reality of the moment, the manifesto acted not as a glue, but as a legal solvent. By publicly admitting that the nationalities had the right to form their own councils, Karl effectively signed the empire's death warrant. The national committees in Prague, Zagreb, and Krakow did not use the manifesto to reform the union. They used it as a legal justification to formally secede from it. The administrative center at the Ballhausplatz in Vienna became a hollow shell, where officials sat at mahogany desks and issued orders to provinces that no longer recognized their language, much less their authority. In the final days of October, the collapse moved with a chaotic, terrifying velocity. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the Adriatic, was handed over to a fledgling Yugoslav council to prevent it from falling to the Italians. In Vienna, the royal family huddled in the cold rooms of the Hofburg, the palace fires extinguished to save fuel. The end was not a bang, but a slow, rhythmic withdrawal of consent. On November 11th, Karl signed a statement of withdrawal, carefully avoiding the word abdication, and departed into the autumn mist. The borders drawn in the aftermath of that chaotic November, decided in the smoke-filled rooms of Versailles and Trianon, remained the bedrock of the modern European map. The collapse of the Habsburg center created a vacuum in Central Europe that would eventually invite the 20th century's greatest horrors, proving that while the empire was often a prison of nations, its disappearance left the cell doors open to a much colder wind. The ghost of Franz Joseph's world still lingers in the architecture of the Ringstrasse, a reminder of a time when a single symbol could hold the disparate pieces of a continent together, until the weight of history finally became too much for one man to bear.
The silence that descended upon the Hofburg in November 1918 was not the silence of peace, but the airless quiet of an architectural collapse. For centuries, the Habsburg monarchy had functioned as a grand machine of synthesis, binding the Alpine peaks to the Carpathian basins through a web of dynastic loyalty and bureaucratic inertia. When the final gears ceased to turn, the dissolution occurred with a haunting lack of violence within the empire's internal borders, driven by a collective psychological exhaustion that rendered the old order a ghost before it was even a memory. The subjects of the dual monarchy did not revolt, they simply walked away, leaving the intricate tapestries of the state to unravel in the wind of an uncompromising nationalism. This transition was marked by a peculiar, somber dignity. A station master in Innsbruck might continue to log train arrivals with obsessive precision, even as the flag above his office was being lowered for the last time. His ledger, a final forensic anchor to a world that no longer existed. Inevitably, the removal of this central scaffolding triggered a catastrophic economic fragmentation that would haunt the continent for generations. The empire had operated as a vast, integrated free trade zone where the industrial heartlands of Bohemia fed the agricultural plains of Hungary, and the port of Trieste served as the essential lung for a landlocked interior. Driven by the sudden fever of sovereignty, the successor states, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and the rump states of Austria and Hungary, immediately erected customs barriers and infant currencies that acted as tourniquets on the region's lifeblood. A merchant in Vienna who had previously shipped grain from the Banat without a single passport check now found his assets frozen by a dozen new borders, each patrolled by officials whose primary instruction was to assert a difference that had not existed a month prior. This balkanization of Central Europe was not merely a political reorganization, it was a deliberate dismantling of a functional ecosystem, replacing shared prosperity with a fragmented landscape of competing poverty and mutual suspicion. The geopolitical consequences were even more profound, as the collapse dismantled the only credible buffer between the expansionist ambitions of Germany and the revolutionary fervor of Russia. For nearly 400 years, the Habsburgs had served as the Danubian shield, a multi-ethnic bulwark that, despite its flaws, prevented any single power from dominating the European heartland. Consequently,
The vacuum left by the empire's disappearance invited the very predatory interests it had once held at bay. The new states, though born of the high-minded rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, were militarily fragile and diplomatically isolated. They were too small to be powers in their own right and too proud to form a new collective federation. This structural weakness meant that Central Europe was no longer an active participant in the balance of power, rather a vacuum waiting to be filled by the radical ideologies of the mid-20th century, as the fragile cordon sanitaire proved to be made of paper rather than steel. Within these new borders, the psychological transition from imperial subjects to national citizens was fraught with a quiet, pervasive terror that permeated the mundane details of daily life. The empire had been a state of many tongues, where identity was often layered and fluid. A man could be a loyal Catholic, a speaker of German, and a proud resident of Prague without contradiction or social penalty. However, the new nationalisms demanded a singular, exclusive loyalty that the geography of the region simply could not support without trauma. In the city of Lviv, known then as Lemberg, an elderly shopkeeper named Joseph found himself an alien in the same street where his family had lived for 3 generations. He spoke the language of the old administration, but the new authorities viewed his very presence as a lingering infection of the imperial past. He was not alone. Millions of individuals suddenly found themselves classified as national minorities, a clinical term that carried the weight of a death sentence in the coming decades of ethnic cleansing. The fragility of this moment is best understood through the lens of a single failed decision that remains one of the great what-ifs of the modern era. Had the Sixtus affair in 1917 resulted in a separate peace for Austria-Hungary, the empire might have transitioned into a federalized United States of Greater Austria, preserving the economic union while satisfying the hunger for local autonomy. The rain-slicked documents of that secret negotiation represent one of history's most agonizing moments, where a few signatures might have averted the total disintegration of the Danubian basin. Instead, the refusal of the Entente to negotiate with a dying power ensured that the collapse would be total and irreversible. The result was a landscape of successor states that were in reality many empires themselves, each containing their own restless minorities and each lacking the historical legitimacy to maintain order without resorting to the very chauvinism they claimed to have escaped. The spirit of the times was of a radical simplification and a desperate desire for clarity in a world that had become too complex to endure. In 1919, the intellectuals in the cafes of Vienna and Budapest were no longer debating the nuances of imperial reform or the benefits of a shared monarch. They were intoxicated by the promise of the pure nation-state. This was a dangerous delusion, for the geography of the Danube did not lend itself to purity. The intricate weaving of Germans, Magyars, Slavs, and Jews was so dense that any attempt to draw a clean border was an act of surgical violence. This forensic reality was ignored by the mapmakers in Versailles, who carved up the corpse of the monarchy with a confidence born of distance and a lack of local knowledge. The consequence was a series of states that were economically non-viable and socially fractured, creating a permanent state of instability that would eventually provide the pretext for the Nazi Anschluss and the subsequent Soviet occupation. Driven by this institutional void, the region became a laboratory for the most extreme political experiments of the age. Without the stabilizing presence of the Habsburg civil service, which had provided a degree of predictable, if slow, justice, the new administrations often fell into a cycle of corruption and authoritarianism. The collective memory of the empire began to warp. For some, it became a nostalgic dream of a golden age of stability, while for others, it was a dark prison to be forgotten at all costs. This split consciousness prevented the successor states from developing a unified resistance to the rising tides of fascism and communism. By the time the 1930s arrived, the vacuum of power was no longer a theoretical concept, but a physical reality, as German agents and Soviet agitators moved through the porous borders of Central Europe with an ease that the old imperial police would have found unthinkable. Today, the legacy of this lost synthesis is still visible in the architecture of the cities that used to form the empire's backbone, serving as a silent testament to a vanished unity. The grand yellow stuccoed railway stations in cities from Krakow to Sarajevo remain as silent witnesses to a time when a single ticket could carry a traveler across half a continent without a change of currency or a hostile interrogation. The vacuum of power created in 1918 was never truly filled by a local successor. It was merely occupied by external empires that brought far more blood and far less tolerance than the old dual monarchy ever had. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary was the end of a flawed experiment in multi-ethnic coexistence, and its absence left a hole in the heart of Europe that the 20th century would spend its most violent decades trying and failing to mend. The borderlines drawn in the candlelit rooms of 1918 still pulse with the tremors of that original collapse, reminding the modern world that the destruction of a synthesis is often far easier than the construction of a lasting peace. The tragedy of the vacuum is that it did not just swallow a dynasty, it swallowed the possibility of a middle way for an entire continent.